experience. As phase one, we did tens of thousands of phase ones nationwide. And about 20 years ago, we started collecting our own data and spent 2.5 years designing the rec check report that you see today. So it was designed by environmental professionals who use that data in their phase ones. And now we phased out phase one Inc. And ERS is our business, and we no longer do phase ones, and we focus on ERS, environmental record search. So I've got a lot of experience. I do not know it all. So that's why you have any questions, any concerns, any comments, anything that can add to my knowledge base, go ahead and chat it to me. It's wonderful. But from my webinars, if you can just pick up one or two things that are going to help you do a better, quicker, more efficient job, and thereby making more money and staying in business and being more competitive, then it benefits us, because hopefully you become a client if you're not already a client of ours. A lot of things I'll talk about, we forms and tracking things, and our report writing template and that kind of thing, that will give copies of that information to our clients. If you're not a client, you need to become a client in order to get some benefits of our 20-30 years of knowledge. As I'm going along, if you have any questions, go ahead. Remember, a lot of this is my opinion, but I think by the time I get done, you'll see exactly where I'm coming from, and you'll understand that it's based on facts. Everything in a phase one has to be based on facts. You can't just say, oh, I think there's a potential possible, maybe kind of sort of a problem on the site. You have to have documentation to back it up. And same with vapor intrusion. So let's talk about vapor intrusion. Anyone have any questions on my resume? I graduated from, just so you know, UC Davis in resource science as my major, and 3 minors: soil science, water science, and environmental toxicology, back in 1986. So I'm an old guy. So let's get started if there's no questions. So vapor intrusion. A lot of our competitors have added reports into their radius search report, our rec check report, have marketed, and in 2013 and 2012, EDR marketed that you were going to be required to have a separate vapor intrusion report and do this modeling, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, all in a phase 1 environmental site assessment. Well, that didn't happen. But in the meantime, they convinced a bunch of banks that they had to have this vapor intrusion report from EDR. And now some of them still currently require you to get that vapor intrusion report. I'm going to give you the tools in the next 2 sessions, part 1 and part 2 of vapor intrusion, so you can combat that and show them that your phase 1 doesn't need a separate vapor intrusion report. There's no law, standard, or anything that requires you to, and that really a phase 1 is designed to come up with whether there's a potential environmental concern or not. Now, sometimes you come up with there is a concern, but a phase 1 isn't supposed to have any sampling, modeling, anything like that on a normal phase 1, at least according to the standards. And remember, we're going to go strictly on what the standards say. So let's get started. Remember, if you have any question, any concern, any comment, chat it to me. And if it's, and most likely I'll post it and we'll go ahead and go forward. So let's go. So potential for vapor intrusion, migration. There is no, in the ASTM 1527-13, there may be in the next one we're talking about it. And the SBA SOP 5010-5J is now, I think it's 5K, it just changed. There is no actual mention of vapor intrusion. So really, let me read you this paragraph, and then we're going to back this up with facts. While completing a Phase 1 environmental site assessment, addressing vapor intrusion of hazardous substances is required. That's why you're doing a Phase 1, is to address hazardous substance or potential for hazardous substances on the site. All standards, ASTM 1527-13A, EPA AI, and the SBA SOP require that you address the presence or likely presence. I consider that potential for vapor intrusion, migration. So they don't say vapor intrusion, they say migration of hazardous materials. And hazardous materials is a recognized environmental condition onto the subject property or within the subject building. The most common hazardous materials related to vapor intrusion or migration are VOCs, volatile organic chemicals. Now, of course, some semi-volatile organic chemicals can get in there and some other things, but mostly it's volatile organic compounds. And we'll go over that in part 2. So the regulations, what do the regulations actually say? So let's back this up and start from, what's the objective and what's a recognized environmental condition. Now, I'm going to quote the sections and I'll put a few things in there every once in a while, which is potential and vapor intrusion versus migration. So if you look up the ASTM E1527-13, it specifically states the purpose of this Phase 1 environmental site assessment is to identify to the extent feasibly pursuant to the processes prescribed here. The process is prescribed herein. It doesn't mean you have to go take soil samples. It doesn't mean you have to take air samples. It doesn't mean anything other than what's prescribed in these regulations herein to identify recognized environmental conditions in connection with the property. So what is a recognized environmental condition? It's very clear. If you look up section 3.2.78, it's the presence or likely presence, which is potential in my book. And remember, I've helped write the standards since 1991 when they first started, actually 92. Presence of any hazardous substance or petroleum product. EPA is the one who wanted it petroleum product, and they went along with hazardous substance or petroleum products in, on, or at the property. 1, due to a release to the environment. That could be a release on-site or off-site. 2, under conditions indicative of a release to the environment. Let's say you got leaking drums would be a good example. And sitting on a concrete, not double contained, and you can see the liquid just seeping into a crack or a seam in the concrete slab. And that's just one of many examples. There's no way I can cover every single example. Or 3, under conditions that pose a material threat of a future release to the environment. So what does that mean? So maybe somebody uses and stores adjacent to your subject property has an air permit, so they use volatile organic chemicals, and they're really sloppy on their housekeeping. That could be a condition that pose a material threat for vapor intrusion down the road. Or let's say you're adjacent to a dry cleaner. You're in a strip mall. Your site's one of the units in a strip mall, and right next door is a dry cleaner. And they have no listed things right now, but we know they're using PCE, perchloroethylene. And, that could pose a material threat of a future release to the environment. So there you go. So the potential of a release. Now, if you know of a release, that's a different thing. It's definitely a recognized environmental condition. But a potential release is a recognized environmental condition. So the ASTM 1527-13 further states the following about vapor migration. And this is really key, and this is why vapor intrusion, you're looking at it. 3.2.56 migrator migration. For the purpose of this practice, migrate and migration. Remember, this is right out of the ASTM and EPA standards. Refers to the movement of hazardous substances or petroleum products. Well, that pretty much covers everything, doesn't it? In any form, including, for example, solid and liquid. But remember, in any form, solid and liquid, at the subsurface or subsurface, and vapor in the subsurface. Vapor migration, vapor intrusion, same thing, guys. So, one of the interesting things that they put in the 2013 ASTM standards and all appropriate inquiry was Note 4. They put in Note 4 because EDR was lobbying so hard to get you to spend more money on their products and to do a phase 1 that, and they at the last minute tried to get this added, and a bunch of us techie guys and environmental scientists who belong to the ASTM committee got it stopped. They put this Note 4 in specifically to address what Tony Bonacore and EDR were doing. And here's the note. Vapor migration in the subsurface is described in Guide E2600. Tony Bonacore wrote that guide. However, nothing in this practice should be construed to require application of the guide E2600 standard to achieve compliance with all appropriate inquiry. So basically it's saying you don't need to do the Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. You don't need to do a separate vapor intrusion report. You actually can use your brain and your experience and take our rec check report and come to whether there's a potential for vapor intrusion or not on your subject property. Period. Through historical and a rec check report, radius search report, you got everything you need in order to define whether your site has the potential for vapor intrusion. Remember, it's only potential. You don't know, nobody knows until they go in and sample for soil, gas, vapor, whatever you want to call it, either along the property line or in the subject property if you suspect your subject property of using solvents. So, in summary, Note 4 above basically says there is no requirement to prepare a separate report in our modeling as part of the all appropriate inquiry of the phase 1. That's it. It doesn't say you're required to do it. And if a bank tells you that you are, point them to this. Print this out. Does vapor intrusion need to be addressed? Of course it does. Just like all other hazardous materials and other pathways, vapor migration or any kind of migration in any form. So yes, just as any potential recognized environmental condition, REC, needs to be addressed, below I will point out how to use the ERS REC check report to assist you in identifying any vapor intrusion REC. So I will briefly go over it. In part 2, we'll actually identify these things. So I've got a question here. Doesn't matter if there is a building or just vapor on the property. Doesn't matter. Potential vapor intrusion if it's vacant land, and it's always been vacant land, but right next door there's been a big, cleanup of dry cleaner spilling PCE and that kind of stuff, and there's vapor in the soil. It doesn't matter. That's potential vapor intrusion on your site. If somewhere down the road somebody uses that site or builds a building or whatever, they need to know about it in case, they need to do a vapor moisture barrier under the slab or something like that. Or if the owner of that property really needs to get them to clean up the vapors on his site. So it does matter. Remember, a phase 1, you're identifying whether there are RECs, and a REC could be either there is a concern on site currently or the potential for a concern. You got to remember that. How far is the dry cleaner from our subject site is too far to be recognized? Let's say it shows up on the quarter-mile radius, but it is on the other strip mall? Other end of the strip mall, maybe? I don't know. Yes. Okay, if it's in your strip mall, that's a whole different setup. Because then you've got to take into account, remember, these vapors come up through the soil and they can get trapped under the slab, and then they can go along the slab in the base rock and transmit a whole lot further than if they don't have something to transmit it. Also, if it's in the same strip mall, they probably use the same sewer system, same water line, trenches, same trenches. And remember, trenches are filled with gravel or rock around the piping and sewer lines and that kind of thing. And so things travel a lot further in that. And because it's connected to your site, even though it's a quarter-mile away, I'd still make it a potential. Especially if you know that it's been there a long time and it has had leakage or spillage and, had a subsurface investigation already, and groundwater is fairly shallow. All those things have to be taken into consideration. But remember, in a phase 1, you're identifying it. You can identify it as a potential concern, and then you can recommend doing vapor sampling or groundwater sampling at your subject site to verify whether it is a concern or isn't a concern. That's the next step. That's not to be done in the phase 1, but that's the next step and could be your recommendation. Remember, you're protecting the person who ordered this report. For whatever reason, you're protecting them. And so you don't know, but you have enough. There is a potential for that contamination on your site. I hope that answered your question. Now, recently, I want to say a couple of years ago, earlier I said none of the standards address vapor intrusion. Well, that's not quite complete. The SBA, under SOP 5010-5J, which was their recent version until just a couple weeks ago, really, and this is still in there, basically said, I want to highlight it because you don't need to re, read the whole thing. Basically, they will not do an SBA loan on an on-site dry cleaning facility. So if the strip mall has a dry cleaner in it, or is the dry cleaner site, whatever, they won't do an SBA loan on it unless you do a phase one and a phase two, period. It is required, and there's no ifs, ands, buts about it. So on-site dry cleaning facilities which may have utilized chlorinated solvents such as tetrachloroethene and trichloroethene, TCE, PCE. That includes Stoddard solvents, a whole bunch of things for old dry cleaners, and or petroleum-based solvents in the course of their business may present significant cleanup costs if these contaminants have entered the soil vapor, and or groundwater. So basically, they're saying, hey, it's a wreck, period, and you must do and undergo a phase two environmental site assessment in addition to a phase one, which would be required. So, period, they addressed vapor intrusion because they had so many problems with it that they then made it absolutely required on a dry cleaning facility that a phase one and a phase two is required. So they did address it in this form. They didn't address it in that you had to do anything extra in the phase one. So in addition to when the SOP 5010-5J came out, there's a couple other things that, and this is January 1st, 2018. So last year, January 1st is when the J standard came out. They also further required that the environmental professional or the environmental professionals company that did the phase one or the phase two must have $1 million of environmental errors and emissions insurance or professional liability. It's got to state environmental on the policy form. If you don't have the environmental rider, basically that insurance is worthless. So if they ever catch you, they won't accept any of your reports ever again until you prove that you have that insurance, if you don't have that insurance. So doing SBA, and I'm guessing right now they're trying to get it in the new ASTM standards, the $1 million liability insurance. So, if you don't have environmental errors and emissions liability insurance, you probably should have just to protect your company, because I know several companies who've gotten sued for making a mistake, and it's not a good thing. So any questions so far? Keep in mind, you can get a copy of this whole presentation, but I'm just, we also have a list, and I'm going to go over that in part two, the main compounds that cause vapor intrusion. And here's the list. You can get a copy of this, and you'll also see this in part two, and I'll go over them in detail in part two. How environmental factors, soil conditions, source location, concentrations, groundwater conditions, those kinds of things play a part in it. Underground conduits, we talked a little bit about. Biodegradation processes. I love this. Attenuation over a period of time of the contaminant in the ground. Well, for years and years, we were able to close sites saying, hey, through biodegradation processes and other things, eventually the contaminant will go away. Well, unless you supplement it, it takes hundreds of years. And most of those cases are being revisited and they're being required to do cleanup. So be careful saying something over a period of time will dissipate, because it really doesn't happen quickly and it doesn't happen that often. Now, if you supplement microbes and enhancing food, really fertilizer, and oxygen to the subsurface, you can get biodegradation to speed up. There's no doubt about it. But not very many people do that. And so through natural attenuation, it doesn't happen very quickly. Okay, as an overview, we basically covered why and what regulations dictate that we have to address the potential for vapor intrusion. It's really not spelled out, but through migration and vapor, it is, and through what is a recognized environmental condition. You are not required, based on Note 4, or need to order a separate vapor intrusion report and or conduct any sampling whatsoever for a compliant Phase 1, according to both standards, ASTM and EPA all-appropriate inquiry. Keep in mind, buying a vapor intrusion report or running a modeling program provided by others, they do not stand behind those reports whatsoever. Read the terms and conditions and disclosures in that report. If you're not buying a radius search report, you do not have $1 million in environmental errors and emissions insurance covering that report. And since you're required on a Phase 1 to have, by a lot of banks and other people, to have $1 million professional liability, and you're getting a 1 mile radius search from another company, read their liabilities, limitations, and their terms and conditions carefully, because they do not cover you. We do. Read ours. And do you want to be insuring their report? Because once you order their report, get their report, and rely on their report, and then read it, interpret it, whatever you do with it, they're relieved of all liability, because they've said, don't stand behind it. We do not insure it. So there you go. What is AVOC and what is vapor intrusion? We discussed that a little bit. We'll discuss it in detail in part 2. What chemicals, products, industries could be a concern for vapor intrusion? We talked about dry cleaners, but you have auto repair. You have some manufacturing, plastics molding. There's a whole bunch of industries and products and stuff, and we'll go over that in super detail in part 2. And part 2 starts, if I'm correct, at 1 p.m. today, Pacific Standard Time, people. What role does local and site environmental factors play in your decision? And we talked about that a little bit. Really, we had a 1/4 of a mile away dry cleaner in the same strip mall or in the same mall area. That's quite a far away. That's a big strip mall or mall. But how the conduits, the utility conduits, and the slab could cause a problem to your subject property. And so what do you got? You got a potential vapor intrusion. And so you really have a recognized environmental condition. And remember, when you're writing Phase 1, you're like an investigator. You're building a case. And you're putting together multiple facts that all say, hey, maybe there's a potential, or maybe there is contamination on site, and you've got a wreck, and you're building a case. So, quickly review for a possible vapor intrusion wreck. And the way I used to do it and used to write phase one reports, and we'll go over how I did it. So the first thing is I'd review a wreck check report. And then I'd mark or write all comments from the field inspection while I'm reading it on specifically designated field checklist. I'd write it on a little notepad, building my case for the different wrecks and where I found the information, because I'm going to put all that in my report writer template. Make sure you have a really good report writer template. We have one that's free, and we'll talk about that in part 2. Review all the historical information about the site and subject site and adjacent site, because that's going to tell you if they had the potential to do something. Review the geologic or lithologic section of the rec check report and the air permit potential dispersion map. It shows all the sites that have VOC permits, and we'll get that real quickly. So we have another question. I meant adjacent strip mall or 1,000 feet away. Sorry. 1,000 feet is a long way. So it really depends on the slope of the land, how deep the groundwater is. Do you know that they've had a release? Most likely you're not going to get it from utilities, although you could still get it from the main sewer line that usually run down the center of the street. Each, the strip malls just get an offshoot from that. It's really case by case. You'd have to add it all together, and we can actually go over a little bit of that in the part 2, but 1,000 feet's far. I mean, I've only seen vapor intrusion on a site. Remember, I've been doing this since 91. I've only seen it on a site. Actually, I've been doing it since 84. Gosh, the furthest away I've gotten vapor intrusion on a site is about 650 feet. And it was a pretty big spill to get vapor intrusion, and it was shallow groundwater. So 1,000 feet's pretty far. I think unless you've got a whole lot of extenuating circumstances, I probably wouldn't make that a potential vapor intrusion. I think that's too far. If you do any of these so-called modeling programs, they're going to 1,000 feet. It ain't going to go. And of course, it depends on the soil lithology too, guys. So. You're welcome. So, part 2 is really important, but it is really easy to determine whether there's a potential for vapor intrusion on your site. First of all, our rec check report has all air permits, which are usually they're given for use of volatile organic chemicals. Paint shops, auto body shops, paint spray booths, dry cleaners, automotive, parts cleaners, manufacturers, that kind of thing. We plot those, and right away you can see if anything's close enough to your site to be a concern. Using a very detailed field checklist for your site assessor or field inspector, whether it's you doing it, who's writing the report, or someone else is doing it, is very important, because it keys you on the right things to look for. and it'll key you on what to look for in vapor intrusion. And we have a great field checklist for different types of properties, 3 different types of properties that we give out, provide for free to our clients. So if you want a copy of that and you're a client, just ask Susanna and she'll send it to you. Make sure your EPs and site inspectors attend some of these webinars. We have one on doing the field inspection. We have one on writing the the phase 1 using our template. Of course, in all these things, we can't cover everything. Somebody said, one time asked me the question, what are all the different ways vapor intrusion, all the different sources that vapor intrusion could come from? And I'm going, oh, you got to be kidding me. I can't name them all. It'd be impossible. It'd take hours and hours and hours, and I'd have to make a huge list. And so each webinar is a little different. Each webinar I supply a little different information. So we've got some people who've attended some of my webinars 4 or 5 times, and hopefully they learn a little something different each time. ERS stands behind all its data. We have $2 million environmental errors and emissions insurance, professional liability, and everything was designed by environmental professionals. It wasn't designed by database people. It wasn't designed by sales people. It was designed by environmental professionals who've been in the business for years and years and years. And we hope it makes your job easier. And we try not to provide any information that's a waste of your time. Although sometimes, we do by mistake. And, we would rather provide a site listing, even though it could be wrong and misplotted, versus not providing that site and you miss something. So anytime you find an error in any of our reports, you tell us, we verify it, and we fix it. Remember, I'll give you an idea of how much data there is. So let's just talk about lust records. Federally, there's 4 million lust records. If we were to verify the site location of every lust record, verify. This means go look up the address, because everybody plots all their sites based on address. We do 2 different things, because we also have a map where if the regulatory agency has a lat long for the site that's over 50 feet different than what we plotted by address, we show you in case it happens to be where the spill was, South 40 or something like that. That's something no one else does. But in any case, all our competitors and us plot all the sites based on address. If we don't have complete address, it can't get plotted. Some of our competitors say they check every single plotting. Well, let me tell you why that's an impossibility. Just in lust records, lust database, and remember, we have over 3,000 databases that we update every quarter. There's 4+ million lust records. The most somebody can do is maybe 6 an hour, 1 every 10 minutes, checking those, verifying the lat long on a record. That means a person can do about 50 a day, really 48, right? But about 50. It'd take one person 80,000 days to do all the lust records, or 10 persons 800 days, or about 3.1 years. 10 people, 3.1 years to check all those records. And by the time you get done, half those records have changed because you got new records. Remember, you're updating it every quarter. It's an impossibility. It doesn't happen, guys. No, all we can do is give you the data that's provided from the agency. When we find a mistake or an error in the data, and you tell us about it, we fix it. And so things get better and better, but it's not ever going to be 100%. It's an impossibility. So if there aren't any questions, I think we're done with part 1 of vapor intrusion. Basically, you do not need to do separate reports or anything, but do you have to address vapor intrusion in your phase 1? Yes, you do. From the standpoint of whether could be potential vapor intrusion on your subject site. Okay, if there isn't any questions, anybody? Oh, vapor intrusion starts at 1:30. I'm sorry. Well, thank you for attending. We hope to see all you guys in part 2. Part 2, I'll go over one case of vapor intrusion. It's really an interesting one. It's fun. But we'll show you how you can piece together all the stuff and come up with that you have a potential for vapor intrusion on your subject property. So if there isn't any questions, thank you very much for attending, and we'll see you in part 2 of 1:30. That gives me time to eat lunch. Thank you very much, and you guys have an excellent rest of the day if you don't come to part 2. And if you get to part 2, I look forward to having you.